Today, we are diving into the chaotic, uncertain, and, let's be honest, the absolutely foundational first decades of the United States. This wasn't some period of quiet confidence. Nope, this was a high-stakes, nail-biting experiment that really could have failed at any moment.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. You've just managed to overthrow the most powerful empire on Earth. The entire world is watching you, basically just waiting for you to collapse. You have no money, no real established government, and you've got these deep, deep divisions among your own people. That was the monumental task facing America's very first leaders.
So here's how we're going to track this journey. We'll look at 5 key challenges. First up, how to even build a republic from scratch. Then we'll get into the bitter political fights that erupted almost immediately. After that, the struggle to just survive in a pretty hostile world. Then, this explosive growth that literally doubled the nation's size. And finally, how a new American identity started to form out of all that chaos.
Okay, let's get right into it with the man who had to figure it all out first, George Washington. I mean, there was no instruction manual for being president. Every single thing he did, from how he dressed to how he talked to Congress, was going to set a precedent, a model, for every president who would come after him. No pressure, right?
And what's so fascinating is how these traditions, these precedents, became the absolute bedrock of the presidency. Think about it, the simple title, Mr. President. That was a deliberate choice to sound different from a king. Or when he used federal power to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, he was proving this new government wasn't going to be pushed around. But, maybe his most radical act of all was stepping down after 2 terms. He was sending a powerful message. In America, power is temporary. It's not for life.
But beyond all the titles and traditions, Washington was facing an immediate existential crisis. The country was completely, utterly broke. The debt from the war was so massive, it was genuinely threatening to sink the new nation before it could even learn how to swim. So, enter the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, with a really bold and, controversial 4-part plan. First, he said the federal government should take on all the war debts from the states. This would bind them all to the new nation. Second, issue new bonds to show the world that America pays its bills. Third, raise money through tariffs, taxes on imported goods, and a new tax on things like whiskey. And fourth, the part that drove his critics crazy, create a national bank to manage the country's finances. They saw it as a dangerous overreach of federal power.
For Hamilton, this was never just about balancing the books. It was about earning respect on the world stage. He knew that without a strong financial system, all those powerful countries in Europe, and even its own citizens, would just see the United States as a joke, a failed experiment.
Now, Hamilton's plan might have been designed to unify the country's finances, but it did the exact opposite to its politics. The fight over his plan was so fierce, so bitter, that it literally split the Founding Fathers and created the nation's very first political parties.
And this, right here, this captures the fundamental divide over what America should even be. On one side, you've got Hamilton's Federalists. They wanted a nation with a powerful central government, a flexible constitution, and an economy driven by manufacturing and trade, kind of like Britain. But on the other side, you have Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. They feared a strong federal government, demanded a super strict reading of the Constitution, and they dreamed of a nation of independent farmers. And they were much more sympathetic to revolutionary France. I mean, these weren't just political disagreements. These were 2 completely different visions for the soul of the nation.
And to really feel the heat of this debate, you just have to look at their own words, which are captured perfectly in the musical Hamilton. Jefferson, speaking for the farming South, basically saw Hamilton's plan as a scam that favored northern bankers over the real producers of wealth, the farmers.
And Hamilton's response was just as sharp. It cut right to the hypocrisy he saw in Jefferson's argument. He fires back that the South's whole agricultural wealth was built on the brutal institution of slavery, a fact that really undercut their moral high ground. Yeah, this wasn't just policy, this was personal.
So as Washington was getting ready to leave office, he's seeing these divisions just tearing the country apart. And his famous farewell address was basically a series of prophetic warnings. He pleaded with Americans to value national unity above everything else, and specifically told them to watch out for the dangers of political parties and getting tangled up in foreign wars.
And wouldn't you know it, Washington's warnings were immediately put to the test. While Americans were busy fighting amongst themselves, the great powers of Europe, Britain and France, they were at war, and they saw the young United States as nothing more than a pawn in their global chess match. And this timeline just shows a nation under relentless pressure. First, in what's called the XYZ affair, France actually demanded a bribe just to talk, an insult that nearly led to war. In response, President John Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which cracked down on dissent right here at home. Then, President Jefferson tried this disastrous economic embargo to stay neutral, but it just crippled the American economy. It was one escalating crisis after another that finally led to 1812, when President James Madison asked Congress to declare war on Great Britain for a second time.
The War of 1812 was this messy, brutal conflict. Britain was messing with American trade and practicing impressment, which is basically a fancy word for kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. Meanwhile, a lot of Americans saw a chance to expand into Canada. The war had incredible lows, like the British actually burning the White House, and incredible highs, like the defense of Fort McHenry, which inspired the Star-Spangled Banner. So militarily, it was pretty much a draw, but psychologically, it was a huge victory. It basically killed off the Federalist Party and sparked this massive wave of American nationalism. So, with the threat from Britain finally dealt with, the nation's focus could shift from just surviving against foreign powers to growing internally. And that growth was about to become absolutely explosive, bringing with it both incredible opportunity and a whole new set of dangerous challenges.
$15 million. That comes out to about 4 cents an acre. It was, and honestly, it still is, one of the greatest real estate deals in all of history.
With that single payment, President Thomas Jefferson bought the entire Louisiana Territory from Napoleon's France. With one stroke of a pen, the United States literally doubled in size, gaining this vast, unknown territory that stretched all the way to the Rocky Mountains. So, of course, Jefferson immediately sent out Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to figure out what in the world he had just bought. Their mission was immense: find a water route to the Pacific, map this new land, establish relations with native tribes, and act like a scientific expedition, documenting hundreds of new species of plants and animals. But all this rapid expansion forced a question the nation had been desperately trying to avoid. Would these new territories allow slavery? See, every new state threatened to tip the delicate balance of power in Congress between slave states and free states. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was basically a desperate attempt to keep that balance. By letting Missouri in as a slave state and Maine as a free state, it was a temporary fix. It just kicked the can down the road, and it revealed this deep, dangerous fault line of slavery that would eventually tear the nation apart.
So, after surviving bitter political fights, a second war with Britain, and the huge challenges of massive expansion, a new, more confident American identity finally started to take shape.
The period right after the War of 1812, during James Monroe's presidency, is actually known as the Era of Good Feelings. With the Federalist Party pretty much gone, there was this temporary halt to all the bitter partisan fighting. The country felt politically united, and that wave of nationalism from the war created this powerful sense of a shared American identity and purpose.
And all this newfound confidence was projected onto the world stage with the Monroe Doctrine. This was America basically planting a flag in the ground, metaphorically speaking. It was this bold declaration to the old empires of Europe that the Western Hemisphere was now off-limits for colonization. For the very first time, America was casting itself as the protector of the New World.
Which, brings us full circle. The nation had survived its chaotic infancy. It had grown powerful and confident, but it had done so by creating the very political parties and navigating the foreign entanglements that George Washington had so deeply feared. And it leaves us with a question to really think about. Was he a wise prophet, or were these challenges simply the unavoidable, messy growing pains of a new republic?